It's showing your coffee table and your
Oh,
foot.
Oh, we're
Oh.
streaming.
well, that's great. I don't want to do that. Okay. All right. So what am I supposed to be doing? Should I just
Put
forget
that
about
button again. There
speaking?
should be two white buttons on your iPad. You
Well,
don't only see
when
one
I hit the
screen.
side, I only have one white button. I only have switch camera. I do
It's
not have.
possible that the webinar doesn't allow the gallery view on the iPad, but I thought we did that.
No, I don't have. I don't have any way to do it because I had it both buttons before.
All
And now I
right,
only have
all right,
one.
group. We are going to be going live. Are you ready?
Yeah, as ready as we're gonna ever be, I guess.
But Judy's not in the picture.
Judy,
It's okay. Don't worry
touch
about
that
it.
one button again because you're going to
Yeah,
see.
click back, Judy, because I could see you previously.
Judy, you have your machine
that
turned
one.
around.
There
There
you
we
go. Okay, now you
Now I
can
can
see
see
you.
you, Judy.
Okay,
right.
I
Just
can't
leave
see
it like
me
that.
or anybody else.
Well, that's okay. That's okay. You'll
I
you
see you.
Watson's screen. Do you see
You
Watson's
see
screen,
from the
Judy?
19th Amendment,
Yes.
Madam
Okay,
President?
that's all that matters. All right, you guys ready? Here we
Yes.
go.
Okay.
When do I start talking?
Hopefully everybody out there can hear us. I'm going to introduce Susan Stein, who is head of the Women's Club. She is going to introduce Dr. Watson and any of the panelists. And we all thank you for joining the webinar sponsored by Dr. Watson and the Women's Club.
Well, good evening, everybody. Close your eyes and imagine that you're all sitting in the social hall of the clubhouse, which, if this were a normal April 13th, we would be doing. But since this is not a normal April 13th, we have been forced to try something a little different, and we're very gratified by the number of people who registered to attend the webinar. Of course, you know, Dr. Watson is our biggest draw of the year, as usual. And tonight's presentation is going to be very illuminating and interesting, as usual. And we don't even, as Judy always says, turn off your cell phones. You don't have to turn off your cell phone because we can't hear you. And now I turn it over to the inimitable Dr. Robert Watson.
Hi, everybody. Hope everybody's well. Hope you're all healthy, safe, and hanging in there through this crisis. Let me first off thank Susan and Judy and Jason for what they've done. As soon as they started announcing all these protocols with COVID, I don't like the concept of social distancing. I think we should call it physical distancing. Of course, we're staying in, my family and I, whenever we must go out to the super or whatever, we wear masks and gloves, but we should call it physical distancing because now more than ever, I think socially, we need to come together, even if it's virtually, and connect and support one another. So what Susan and Judy and Jason are doing is, I think, a wonderful service for Valencia Falls and a way of offering an opportunity for us all to come together through this enrichment program. And I'm delighted to be a part of it. I wish I could see all of you and was there in person. I have a lot of friends in your community and always enjoy coming out. So before I jump into that, just a quick word on where we are with this virus. Again, I don't like the concept social distancing. My concern with all this is, of course, whatever numbers are being released in terms of the number of cases and the number of people that have passed. We have not even tested 1% of the American public. So I think tragically, the numbers are significantly higher than what we're hearing because we simply aren't testing a significant percentage of the country. So whatever numbers we're hearing seem to be alarmingly higher. My other concern or worry is that I just don't think our politics are right for this kind of situation. And I'm not talking about just the president or the Congress, but I mean our politics writ large. We're at a point with our national politics where we're blaming one another rather than fixing problems. We need solutions and not finger pointing. Yet tragically, I think we're in a position where fear has replaced fact in our national politics. We're also at a point where we seem to be anti-science in a lot of our national politics, in this anti-science, conspiracy theory, fear replaces fact, and a kind of an us versus them mentality. So I worry about our ability to come together and solve this problem with this kind of ethic in our politics. The other concern about our politics today, and it transcends just the US, it's international, is we don't need just a solution for Palm Beach County. We don't need just a solution for Florida. We don't need a national plan. We need international cooperation. Yes. This is truly a global pandemic. Yet in the United States and in many parts of the world, we have moved away from international cooperation to this idea of isolationism. The United States has withdrawn from international leadership, and we're seeing regimes around the world also withdrawing from internationalism and a sense of engagement with the rest of the global community. So we're not sharing ideas, we're not cooperating. Our politics going into this problem were not conducive to solving it. So we need a fundamental transformation, I think, of the way our politics are working or are not working today to begin to solve this. I also think, as an historian, that it's inescapable to think about examples of great leadership during times of crisis historically. And I've been spending a lot of time the last few weeks thinking about Abraham Lincoln's handling of the Civil War, when he led from a position of empathy and magnanimity in terms of forgiving the enemy and trying to bring the South into the fold. Lincoln said during the war that his most important duty was, quote unquote, to appeal to our better angels, to try to lift us up and do that together rather than tear us down and appeal to the lowest common denominator. I'm also reminded, and I've been thinking a lot about Franklin Roosevelt's leadership during the Great Depression and World War II, where he came on the radio with the fireside chats and spoke straight talk, the truth, and in a calm voice, engaged the nation in a constructive conversation about the problems facing us and where we were headed. And I think that kind of engagement was absolutely so vital to getting out of the depression and successfully managing the war. And of course, as you all might have guessed, I've been thinking a lot about Harry Truman's leadership during times of crisis during his presidency in the post-war years. Truman, for example, was not concerned with his polls when he had to make tough decisions. He was not concerned with his approval rating or his, the number of people listening to him on the radio or the number of people watching on television as it's in its infancy when he was getting started. Truman was not concerned with publicity or public relations. In fact, scholars, historians always talk about the modern presidency beginning with FDR and running all the way up. And a defining aspect of the modern presidency is this fixation with public relations, almost a daily propaganda, if you will, in that presidents seem to spend as much time on the publicity as they do the policy. And anytime they try to launch a major initiative, they're thinking as much about what publicity event can they do to increase their poll numbers and their ratings as they are what is the right policy. And that's been a defining part, I think, of the modern presidency. But scholars all agree that of all these modern presidents, the one who is the exception to the rule is Harry Truman. Truman spent very little time talking about publicity or planning propaganda publicity events to coincide with the great pronouncements and policy issues that he promoted. In fact, he did almost none of it. I've always liked to think about it in this respect. Rather than being worried about polling his approval numbers or his ratings, Truman was worried about getting it right. And Truman had a unique take on publicity and trying to promote his policies when his aides would talk about, publicity campaign. Instead of that, he simply did the following. He told the truth. Truman knew that the truth was the best form of publicity or propaganda. And by being honest and frank with the public and telling the truth, that built support for his programs, probably more than any propaganda, publicity event, or PR campaign they may have come up with. So I think as we move forward, it would behoove all of our political leaders from the local level up to consider these great and inescapable lessons of leadership during other times of crisis. And I don't want to say much more on that because I don't want to get political. But now a great story. Here we are in 2020, celebrating the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And by all intents and purposes, it will look like Joe Biden is the presumptive Democratic nominee. We'll pick a female vice presidential nominee. So we will have the second vice presidential nominee that's a woman in the Democratic Party's history after Geraldine Ferraro. And there's a good chance that you could have a sitting woman vice president after this election. There's been a lot of discussions that Biden would, if he won, and I think this will be a tight race, would serve only a single term, which would position as vice president for the presidency. We also, during this 2020 campaign cycle, we had 6 women running on the Democratic side. 6. That's a record in history. So I think we're moving toward this notion that it's not if, but when we finally elect Madam President. And I think the story goes back 100 years to the 19th Amendment. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. And it's a wonderful story. So let's begin. The story of the 19th Amendment, if you can see my slide. It begins with these 2 ladies in the year 1840. That's Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who should be on the left of your screen, and in the middle, Lucretia Mott. Stanton was from New York, was remarkably well-read, was remarkably enlightened for the time. Mott also was well-read. She was from Massachusetts. She was a Quaker, and they were 2 of the early mothers in the women's movement. What's interesting about these 2 is they embraced a reading of Christianity, and I don't mean to offend, but oftentimes when we think of Christianity and religion today, we see them as forces not of progress, of enabling rights and expanding rights, but of contracting rights, of conservatism and status quo. But Stanton and Mott read scripture, read the Bible, and viewed it as, today we would use the term feminist theology, or you might have heard of the term liberation theology. Those terms were not around back in 1840 when these 2 were beginning their efforts. But by present day parlance, here's what it meant. Both Mott and Stanton, when they read the New Testament, they saw the figure of Jesus as very feminine. They saw him as what we would say a proto-feminist, if you will. There were masculine issues like war and anti-crime and the economy. And there were feminine issues, nurturing, healthcare, children's issues, education. They saw the figure of Jesus as being very feminine in that he was anti-war. He was for women. He was for forgiveness. You know, blessed are the meek. The Sermon on the Mount lecture, consider the lily, and the symbolisms of peace, forgiving prostitutes, and so on. So they drew great comfort from Jesus's teachings, thinking that he was advocating equality. So unlike a lot of Christians today, they used Jesus and Christianity as a tool for promoting women's rights and equality rather than suppressing women. So back in 1840, these 2 begin. Here's what they did. You got to love this. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had just gotten married, and her husband says, okay, what do you want to do for the honeymoon? She heard that there was an international anti-slavery convention in Europe. She says, for my honeymoon, I want to go to the International Anti-Slavery Convention. That's my kind of gal. So they go all the way to Europe. And when she gets to the Anti-Slavery Convention, she's shocked to find out women are not admitted. So she goes all the way to Europe, and women are not allowed in. So she's out in the, outside of the center where they had this convention, and she's livid and she's stewing, and she runs into another lady there, Lucretia Mott, who's up on your screen. Mott goes all the way to Europe and finds out the same thing, that women aren't invited. So the two of them are sitting down talking about, we need to start a women's movement. We need to advocate for the right to vote for women, and we need to organize something. During a break in the proceedings, a man that was one of the attendees and one of the featured attendees comes out and sees the two of them, strikes up a conversation with them, and he agrees that he will work with them. Who was that man? Frederick Douglass, the great former slave orator who would become best friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So the three of them agree that when they get back to the US, they will promote this movement. That happens 8 years later. In 1848, the three of them organized a convention in Seneca Falls, New York, the Seneca Falls Convention. They meet at the Wesleyan Chapel for 2 days in the month of July of 1848. They have just over 300 conferees in attendance. Not just women, they invite men too, but men are only admitted during the second day of the conference. Frederick Douglass is one of the attendees. So at the conference, they have 11 resolutions that they introduce. The first 10 resolutions dealt with day-to-day kind of issues. Number 11 was the right to vote. That was the controversial one. So the first 10 they dealt with on day one. They were things like this. Women couldn't legally inherit property. Women could not legally divorce. Men could divorce. They had no fault divorce. Women could only be divorced. Women couldn't, custody issues. Today, it's interesting that almost by default, if there's a divorce involving a married family, the woman gets custody almost by default. Back then, it was the exact opposite. The man got custody. In fact, if the husband had died, a lot of times the children would be sent to a brother of the husband or a brother of the wife. So women were fighting for the right to divorce, the right to inherit property, the right to custody, fighting for things like the right to practice medicine, the right to practice the law, admission to college. So all these things, the right to appear in a court of law. So these were resolutions 1 through 10. All those passed, I'm happy to say. When they get to resolution 11, they're not so sure. They pause the convention and say, look, we're liable to anger too many men. We're liable to turn off religious folks if we push for the right of women to vote. So they pause the convention. Also, Stanton and Mott don't think they're going to get enough votes. So they have a call for a recess. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass go outside and talk among themselves. Should we do this or not? Should we push resolution 11? Stanton says, you darn right we should. Let's do it. So they both plan to go in and give speeches. Stanton speaks and then Douglass speaks. Douglass, of course, was the Martin Luther King of the middle 19th century, a magnificent orator and rhetorician who just was dripping with charisma. He must have given one of these bring the roof, knock the roof off the building speeches. And after those two spoke, they called for the resolution and it passed. They passed resolution 11, calling for the right to vote. Now, in the interim, however, some things happened. As the movement was gaining momentum in the 1850s and 60s, the Civil War breaks out. And the mothers of the movement put the movement off because of the Civil War wisely, but they're among the leading foot soldiers in the Civil War. Some of them go undercover and serve as spies. Some faked their identity and served as soldiers, dressed as men. Many of them served as nurses. Now, that's the photo I have up here. I want you to imagine being a nurse in 1862 at one of these field hospitals with rudimentary medicine. If a man was shot, soldier was shot in the arm, if that shattered a bone, there's no way to, in the primitive medical technology, and a doctor, a surgeon in the field with hundreds, if not thousands of soldiers being carried into him, there was no way to save it. The easy thing to do was they gave him a shot of alcohol, have him bite down on leather, and they amputated the arm, the foot, the finger, the hand, the leg. There were descriptions, apologize for this, but there were descriptions of next to these tents in these field hospitals, a 10-foot high pile of limbs just atrocious. Now imagine the nurses who had to clean off the table with a bucket of water, put the limbs in the pile, hold the man down, try to calm him during this kind of butchery, this bloody surgery. And remember, it's not that they went to a university to get a nursing degree. They were just volunteers who were learning on the fly. So they more than proved their mettle by serving during the war in all these capacities. As the war was ending in 1865, they added some new efforts to the women's movement. It was the mothers of the movement during and after the war who created a lot of orphanages and worked on the idea of adoption. Think about it. You have 600,000 men gone, lost, dead during the war, and countless tens, if not hundreds of thousands more amputees who had lost their jobs, who had, and there was virtually no system for orphanages or adoption. You would all agree that our foster care system today is in shambles and desperately in need of reform. So they were the foot soldiers in that movement for children adoption orphanages. They also were the leaders in the temperance movement, teetotaling against alcohol. Now, I have always argued that textbooks do a terrible job of presenting the temperance movement. Sure, I enjoy an occasional drink from time to time, but the temperance movement depicts them as these fuddy-duddy, teetotaling women who were against alcohol and were ultra, Christian and out of touch with the reality of. Not so. The mothers of the movement, Stanton, Mott, and others who advocated the temperance movement, they didn't do it because they were anti-alcohol. They did it because they were anti-abuse of women. We did not have terms like domestic violence, date rape, spousal abuse. Those terms were not in existence back then. They're recently added to our vernacular circa the 1960s and 70s. But you can only imagine the numbers of domestic violence and rape cases back in the 1870s, 80s, 90s must have been off the charts. We all know that domestic violence, date or acquaintance rape, and things of this effect are grotesquely underreported today, and yet the numbers are alarming. Imagine back then. I've written several books set in the 1700s and 1800s. I like both periods. I just finished a book on George Washington. Sadly, it was supposed to be released 2 weeks ago, but the publisher's holding it until November, December, January, February, whenever this virus is done. And I also just finished a book on the Civil War, same story. They're holding everything off. So I like those two periods, and I've done a lot of work. I've read hundreds, if not thousands, of newspaper articles, diaries, letters, military reports from that era. I have a rule that I use. I estimate that in the 17 and 1800s, 1 out of every 3 men was a full-blown alcoholic. I mean, face down, day in and day out, drunk. Alcoholism was a severe crisis back then, pandemic, you might say. So imagine rape and violence and broken households. So that's why the women favored temperance. They also were the foot soldiers in supporting and advocating on behalf of Reconstruction. This is Lincoln's wonderful policy of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War. Reconstruction would go from 1865 to 1877. Rather than punish the South, rather than demand war reparations or demilitarization or what the Allies did to Germany after World War I, which I think allowed the rise of the next Reich. But Lincoln's policy toward the South was magnanimity. Lincoln forgave the South and tried to bring them back into the fold, even though the South started the war, even though it was the South during the war that stopped prisoner exchanges, even though it was the South during the war that when Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1, 1863 is when it went into effect, they announced no more prisoner exchanges, no more prisoners. If there's a black soldier in uniform, or because Lincoln emancipated, the South would kill every man, woman, child near and on the battlefield rather than accept prisoners. And it was the South that systematically slaughtered and tortured and abused Northern prisoners in places like Andersonville, Libby, and several other notorious and wretched prisons in the South. Sure, there were some Northern prisoners that were, indefensible, but generally, Northern prisons operated reasonable for the time, whereas generally the Southern prisons were charnel houses. So despite all that, Lincoln said, his famous second inaugural, both sides drew the sword. Both sides prayed to the same God. We were both guilty. So Lincoln's policy of magnanimity, this was not popular in the North. Every town buried their sons. Every family lost a dad, a son, a cousin, a brother, everyone. But Lincoln's policy was backed by the mothers of the movement. It was Stanton, Mott, and the women advocating for suffrage who advocated Lincoln's policy of forgiveness, rebuilding, AKA Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. 13th was in 1865. This is what ended slavery. It's the only one of the three amendments Lincoln lived to see. This is the subject of the great Steven Spielberg film, Lincoln. The 14th Amendment was 1868. That's the Equal Protection Clause. And the 15th Amendment, 1870, was Negro male suffrage. You and I would say black men had the right to vote. Now, the mothers of the movement back the 13th and 14th, remember, they were favoring abolition, anti-slavery before most men were. But they also favored equal protection. Now, when it came to the 15th Amendment, black men getting the right to vote, the women in the movement were split. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, I don't think we should support this unless if it also gives rights for women to vote. Lucretia Mott said, no, we need to support this. This is what we're about. We've been favoring for the right to vote, abolition, expansion of suffrage rights, voting rights. So we need to support it. Stanton was not certain about this. She worried that if not now, when would women get the right to vote? And isn't it interesting to think how she might have been right? After 1870 with the 15th, it takes another 50 years, a half century, before women get the right to vote in 1920. But she ultimately came on board and they passed the 15th Amendment. Now, after the Civil War, there was new leadership in the movement. Stanton and Mott were still active, but new leadership was Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and others. That's Susan B. Anthony up there in the picture that you can see. By the way, I've never been a big Susan B. Anthony fan. I'm more of a Lucy Stone fan. The women's movement split in two camps. Susan B. Anthony was the head, you can see I put it up on the screen, of the NWSA. That's the National Women's Suffrage Association. Stone was the head of the AW, that's the American Women's Suffrage Association. It split. It split over a contentious issue that we're still fighting over: family planning, birth control, and abortion rights. Susan B. Anthony was conservative, and she was against abortion rights and family planning. Stone advocated for it. This is why I think today our textbooks and all that, and our, the Susan B. Anthony dollar, we celebrate Susan B. Anthony because she was a little safer. Stone advocated for abortion rights, family planning, and so on. Now, Stone's position, which was also Elizabeth Cady Stanton's position, think about this. Think about the number of children that women would have circa 1800s. It was not uncommon to have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 kids. It was also not uncommon to have them one after another, year after year. It's also not uncommon to have 20, 30, 40% infant mortality rates. So imagine the horrific condition of women denied any sense of family planning, abortion rights, and control over reproductive rights. How do you have equality? How do you vote? How do you have a job? How do you get active in politics if you have 4 kids, ages 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're pregnant? It's impossible. So Stone, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others favored that. Things were so bad back then. You've all probably heard of the Comstock laws in New York. There were laws that said that if you mailed pornography, it could be a letter, it could be an image. If you used the Postal Service to distribute pornography, that was a federal crime, and each state would have their versions of it, and some localities did. Well, here's the kicker. If I were to send you, and you're a woman, if I sent a young woman educational materials on family planning and a 9-month cycle of pregnancy, they considered that pornography. So you could be arrested for even sending out educational information. So this is how bad it was. And that division remained for several years. Now we get to someone I really like, and that's Carrie Chapman Catt. There she is. Big fan of Triple C, Carrie Chapman Catt. She does a lot for the movement. She's one of the main forces in the movement. Catt, first of all, says, why are we fighting with one another, the National and the American Women's Suffrage Association? She brings both movements together into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So she pulls both movements together. She also changes tactics and strategy. She's very media savvy. She works with younger women to try to get them to talk to newspapers, talk to journalists, and get their stories covered in the press. She felt that that would be a paradigm shift if people read a young woman talking about the right to vote in politics. And guess what? She was informed, articulate, and impressive. So Carrie Chapman Catt works with women to talk to the press, and people were reading women talking intelligently about politics, and that was shocking for the time. She also says, I'm not so sure that it's too late. It's not too late for our generation, older women. We need to focus on younger women. And if we can get them in their teens and 20s, they're going to be the next leaders of the movement, and they are the ones who are going to get the right to vote. So she focused on younger men and younger women. Then finally, her main legacy, and I think this is a hoot, is she said, let's not just try to get a constitutional amendment passed. To get a constitutional amendment passed, you need what? 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and then 3/4 of the states. She said, we've been fighting for that. That's not happening. Let's go state by state by state. That's her policy. We'll go state by state by state. And here's her argument. We're going to need those states anyway if we have a constitutional amendment. So she moves state by state. Now, you and I would guess the first states she would prioritize would be what? New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut. That's what you would think. She says, no, the territory of Wyoming. She says, let's look at Idaho, Montana, Utah, Colorado. This is the wild, wild West, straight out of a Clint Eastwood or John Wayne movie. So you think that's counterintuitive. She got a lot of pushback. Here's what she knew, though. Those states had almost no women. There would be thousands of men to every one woman, which meant men were really desperate. So desperate they were willing to come to the negotiating table. So what Carrie Chapman Catt does is she goes to them and says, if, you know, the territory of Wyoming, the state of Montana, if you give women the right to vote, I promise I will bring women out to your state. And guess what they did? You're right. They were so desperate in the 1890s, state after state after state. And it was all these rural Western cowboy states that were the first to push the right to vote for women. Now, what Carrie Chapman Catt then said is, okay, you held your end of the bargain, but before I uphold mine, I need something else for you. We need the right to divorce, the right to own land, the right to inherit property, the right to custody, the right to practice medicine, the right to get a business license, the right to go to college, the right to, and all those men were so desperate. What did they say? Yeah, sure. Now hurry up and get the women out here. So before this, they would just, you know, every month there was a contractor, if you will, that would get a wagon load of prostitutes from the East Coast and drive them all the way out to the West. Carrie Chapman brings a lot of young women out there, but here's what she told them. If you're a young woman and you want to get a business license, good luck anywhere in the country. But once you go out West now, they gave them the business license. And there's not much competition, whether it's a laundromat or a restaurant or you name the service. These women were able to open up businesses, make a lot of money. And of course, they had their pick when it came to a boyfriend or a husband. And Carrie Chapman Catt got it done. And what we start to see is state by state by state, women are passing, these Western states are passing the right to vote, and women are going out there. The next moment in the women's movement, here we go, 1913, the inauguration. So President Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was president from 1901 to 1909. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was a great progressive. He was a Republican and a progressive. Remember, the two political parties switched positions from 1901 to 1909 under Teddy Roosevelt. So if you were a Republican in the 1800s, you'd be a Democrat in the 1900s. And if you were a Democrat in the 1800s, you'd be a Republican in the 1900s. So Lincoln, who the Republicans today celebrate with Lincoln Day, Lincoln would absolutely be a liberal Democrat today. No debate, no question. Whereas Jefferson, who the Democrats and Jackson, the Jefferson-Jackson dinner, Those two guys, the Democratic Party today celebrates, no, they'd both be Republicans today. So the party switched under Teddy Roosevelt. So he was a Republican, but a progressive. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt was the great progressive. He's the one that got child labor laws passed. He got a prototype of a minimum wage. Teddy Roosevelt got a standardized work week. I always tell my students, one of the greatest inventions of history, thanks to progressives in your local union, the weekend. So he got a standardized work week, child labor laws. After Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, was published in 1905, 6, he got meat inspection for Purity in Foods Acts passed. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt was the great conservationist. National parks, wildlife refuges. The first one, by the way, down here in Florida, a bird refuge near the Everglades. So Teddy Roosevelt was the great progressive. Teddy Roosevelt fought for two other things that he was unsuccessful in getting passed. Universal health care, yeah, all the way back then, and women's right to vote. So after Teddy Roosevelt, women were energized that you had a president that was talking about all that. Then you had Taft in between, who was, not supportive of anything. But then Woodrow Wilson is running in 1912. And Wilson is a progressive, a former professor or president of Princeton. Wilson says, I'm going to finish TR's progressive agenda, even though the two of them didn't like one another personally. So women are excited. Woodrow Wilson's running in 1912. He wins the presidency. So women say that's it. In 1913, he'll advocate for women's right to vote, and we'll have women's suffrage. Here you can see the big parades. Back then, Inauguration Day was March 4th. It was moved up to where it is today, January 20th in 1937. So on March 4th, so March 3rd, the day before the inauguration, 1913, you can see the parade there. Massive parade, hundreds and hundreds of women. Some had giant hats. They rode on horseback, dressed like Amazon women with a sword. Women were marching. They knew that it was any day now. Here's the problem. Wilson takes office and flip-flopped. He opposes women getting the right to vote. So they were shocked and saddened. Something happened, however. Woodrow Wilson's wife, Ellen Axon Wilson, dies in the White House while serving as First Lady. When she passes, Wilson was having an affair with a woman named Peck, Mrs. Peck. In fact, they used to call Wilson Mrs. Peck's bad boy. They would go to her bungalow in Bermuda and have their things. But so Wilson is racked with guilt when his wife passes. He has 3 daughters. So Wilson is thinking after Ellen passes of ways that he can, advocate on behalf of women. Around that time, he meets a saucy widow, and there's a picture of her, Edith Bowling Galt, G-A-L-T. She's a widow. Her husband was a jeweler who left her with a lot of money, and she was opinionated and just didn't care. Newspapers would write about how scandalous she was. Would you like to hear how scandalous she was? I don't know. I know Valencia Falls is up for a lot of things. So, all right, here it is. Here's how scandalous she was. Here's what they would write about her. She would drive her own car. Yep. I'm not making that up. She drove her own car. So that was a huge scandal. Here's another one. She would go to parties unescorted. A woman needed to have a date or whatever. She would go to parties unescorted. So she was really, really scandalous. Wilson meets Edith, and she rocks his world. There's a certain period of time that you're supposed to be in mourning before you start actively courting or marrying. Wilson moved real quickly. He moved faster than the Brisket Brigade at Valencia Falls, and that is fast. So he moved really quickly and started, I've been watching, I pay attention. He moved really quickly with courting Edith. In fact, the press would follow them around when they would court. He would take her out in a carriage ride, and the press followed along, covering everything they did. They would even stake out the White House, and they would watch her come out early in the morning. Yeah, scandal. In fact, when World War I started, the joke around Washington was Edith was so shocked when World War I started, she was still courting Wilson at the time, that she fell out of the president's bed. That's what they said. And of course, one of the great typos in history occurs when he's courting her. The press meant to write that President Wilson was again seen in public entertaining the widow, Miss Galt. But somebody typed the wrong word. And the story in the newspaper said the president was again seen entering in public Miss Galt. So there's your great typo. So it was a big scandal. Wilson marries Edith. And one of the things Edith brings into the wedding, you probably guessed, is she said, this is all fine and dandy, but you're going to support women getting the right to vote. So she advocates for women getting the right to vote. The women's movement is back on. They're excited again. And in 1918, and I put it up here on the slide, they push for women to get the right to vote. Wilson endorses it. Edith lobbies Congress. And as you know, you need 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate. It's 2 votes shy. It almost passes. It's 2 votes shy in the Senate, which is a shame. Now, instead of waiting several years, Wilson took office in 1913, as I said. The women's movement said, we need to push this again while it's hot, while it's only 2 votes shy, and while Edith is still the first lady. So in 1920, they brought it back up again. And here's one of my favorite stories from history about the 19th Amendment passing. I call the story A Man, a Mother, and a Good Boy. The man, and there's the photograph of him, that's Congressman James Mann, 2 N's, from Illinois. He was the one who introduced the bill that would become the 19th Amendment for women to get the right to vote. And this was smart of the women's movement, Lucy Stone, Alice Paul, and others. Here's what they said: let's get a Republican to introduce it to show that this is bipartisan. So Mann was a Republican from Illinois who supported this bill and introduced it. Now, it has to pass the House, has to pass the Senate. You can see the numbers I put up on the screen. Convincing, look at that. Passes the House and Senate. Now it needs 3/4 of the states to be ratified. Here's the concern. The opponents to women getting the right to vote, the opponents to women's equality, never thought it would pass. But when it quickly passes the House and Senate, they mobilized. Who are the opponents that mobilized? Southerners, conservatives, Christians. They mobilize in a big way, and now the battleground is each state. Quickly, all the southern states, except one, no surprise, Alabama, Mississippi, Virginia, et cetera, they all vote to kill it. The western states, remember those rural western states that didn't have many women, they all immediately voted to pass it. And of course, the more progressive Northeast votes to pass it. So they pass. By March of 1920, they are 1 state shy. It all comes down to 1 state. That state is, drum roll, Tennessee. So the mothers of the women's movement were worried because Tennessee is a Southern conservative state. The Christian Southerner conservatives who opposed women's rights, they were thrilled because it was obvious that Tennessee was going to kill this. There was a massive push in Tennessee. Conservative Christian Southerners, the opponents, the women, progressive, everybody descends on Tennessee, and it's a full-on lobbying effort. Here you can see the sign, a picture I have there. Instead of the Women's Suffrage Association, they organized the headquarters of people opposed to women's suffrage. It got really, really ugly. They were saying that if women get the right to vote, they'll no longer want to have children. The population will dry up, and that'll be the end of the United States. Women won't want to get married. Women will fight in wars. It's the end of times. It's the end of what we know. So they were really working on fear mongering, if you could imagine those groups appealing to fear and paranoia. So they were blatantly fear mongering. The other thing they were doing is they were playing with the word ratification. They were all saying that ratification was a rat, that they smelled a rat in ratification, which was that old Patrick Henry line from the Revolution. So they smelled a rat in ratification, and they were opposing it. So it comes down to 1 state, Tennessee. Tennessee has the vote for women's suffrage, and the vote is a tie, 48-48. Now, my story, A Man, a Mother, and a Good Boy. Here's the mother and the good boy. This is the good boy. The picture I have, that's Representative Harry Byrne. He's in his early 20s. He's 23. He's the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature. Doesn't he look like a little kid there? So it's a 48-48 tie. And at the end of the tie, they realized they were missing 1 member of the legislature, Harry. Harry T. Byrne was at home sick. So everybody rushes to find Harry Byrne. And now here's the good news for Southerners and Christians and conservatives who are against women's equality. Harry Byrne was a conservative who represented a very conservative district. So he's at home sick. Now, Harry still lives with his mother. This is where the mother comes in. And they go to get Harry, and the mother realizes he's the one vote that could break the tie. So she gives him his soup. Good Jewish mother, probably, right? Gives him his soup, dresses him up. She tells him, now, you go and cast a vote. She writes on a piece of paper for him to open up and read before he votes, and she puts it in his pocket. When he goes to vote, what does the piece of paper say? It says, don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. And Harry Byrne voted for the 19th Amendment. And from 1840, for decades, it all comes down to one vote, and it passed, thanks to the good boy, the mother, and the man. Happy to say Harry Byrne was narrowly reelected. He goes on to a long career, becomes an attorney, and he always favors women's rights because he was a good boy. He listened to his mother. So that's the story of the 19th Amendment. Let me just tell you a little bit about women running for the White House and some challenges that women face, and then we'll call it a night. So several years ago, I did two studies. One was I surveyed hundreds and hundreds of women in elected office, city council, mayor, state senate, you name it, all across the country. And I followed that up by interviewing several dozen women in elected office. And I asked them all just one simple question. What's the big challenge you face in politics on account of being a woman? So what do women face that men don't face? How is it different for women? And the number one thing they all told me was fundraising. It's harder for women to raise money than men. Here's what you find. In almost every election, the person that raises the most money wins. In almost every election, the incumbent beats the challenger and the incumbent raises more money. So the problem for women, they're usually the challenger, and it's harder for women to raise money to begin with. Therefore, they're not winning election in numbers similar to men. Now, I don't mean the checks for a couple of bucks that we might send to a candidate, Trump or Biden, but I mean the big bucks, the Koch brother money, the George Soros money, the big bucks that go to a candidate. That's still of, by, and for men. In recent times, we still find this to be true that men grotesquely out fundraise women. In recent times, two women have been able to compete with men dollar for dollar. That's Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin. Those are the two great female fundraisers. But so fundraising is the big issue. There was one woman, she was the only female member of the Alabama State Senate. I asked her what her big challenge was. And she said, oh, that's easy. I don't golf. So I said to her, okay, what do you mean by that? She said, well, where do you think the money's raised? She said, it's raised in the press box of the Alabama-Auburn football game. Nobody will have me there. It's raised in the locker room. I'm not legally allowed to go in there. Or she said, it's raised on the golf course and no men will have me along golfing. So I told her, with all due respect, you need to learn to golf. She said, I'm a mother with kids and a job. You know, state legislatures are part-time. She said, I can't golf. Golf takes half a day. So her argument was that because of that, she can't raise that kind of money. I don't golf. I'm too busy to golf. What did Mark Twain call golf? Quote unquote, a good walk interrupted. So women are having trouble raising money, raising that kind of money. Think about it. You've got to go to Rotary. You got to go to Kiwanis. You got to go to all these clubs. If you are raising children and have a job and are in a marriage, who has time to raise money? So until women can even out that fundraising advantage, women are always going to be at a competitive disadvantage in getting elected in public office. And that's nowhere truer than the presidency, which is requiring hundreds of millions of dollars, if not $1 billion as the price tag on the White House. The second thing that women mentioned to me the most, and I have it listed here on your slide, is the second shift syndrome. Now, they didn't say that per se. They said it in so many words. Cultural anthropologists and sociologists talk about the second shift syndrome. Here's what it is. And I'm sure none of you can relate to this in your marriages and your lives, but here's what it is. In two-income marriages, guess who still does 80, 90% of all the domestic work? Right, the wife. The child rearing, the cooking, the cleaning, the shopping, the sewing, the laundry, the diaper changing. So women are still doing 80, 90% of the second shift of all the domestic work, which means they don't have time to run for political office or join Rotary, Kiwanis, golf, the local Republican club, whatever it is that you do. So whereas men have the time to do that, study after study, even today, show that in 2-income married families, men have on average 2 to 3 times more leisure time than the average woman. Now, I'm not sure about Valencia Falls because that's paradise and you all have tennis and all the lectures and all the fun things to do, a pool. But in general, women have significantly less leisure time than the average man. And that's a competitive disadvantage until we can change that. The third thing they mentioned to me was the empty nest syndrome, in so many words. And here's what this is. Question: when do men run for political office? Answer: whenever the hell they want to. Question: when do women run for political office? Right, when the children are grown and out of the right. Now, here's the concern. If people are waiting to marry until much older age, waiting to have kids until they're older, with the economy and the cost of everything today, kids are staying at home until they're 23, 24, 25. Women are going to be perceived as being too old once they start running for office, especially until they work their way up to running for senator, governor, or president. So the empty nest syndrome is a problem. Here's another thing that they talked about. There have been a number of studies, and I don't know if this is the right word, so hold on, but women might be less ambitious than men. Now, that's not the right word. Maybe the right word is prudent, cautious, more wiser. I don't know what the right word is, but here's what you find. Study after study shows when men are asked, would you run for office if you only had a 5% chance of winning? Men say, of course. Women, would you run for office if you only have a 5% chance of winning? No. Next question. Men, if you had to take a second mortgage on your house, would you still run for office? Of course. Women, no. Next question. Men, if you know that you're going to get negative campaign ads, your opponent's going to blitz you with these horrendous 30-second commercials that every candidate faces, that our politics have become just a horrific bloodbath of negativity, 30-second lies, and people believe this crap. Maybe not at Valencia Falls or me, but everybody else believes this nonsense. Ridiculous. But if you knew, men, that you're going to be the subject of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in negative campaign ads, would you still run for office? Answer: yes. Women, no. So I'm not sure if it's ambition or prudence or wiser or cautious. I don't know what the word is. Get your thesaurus out, but here's the point. If you're running for office, you need to be a single-minded seeker of election and be undeterred in running for office. If women are worried about negativity and blah, 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 they're simply not going to get elected on numbers similar to what men are facing. In my own life, in my own marriage, my wife and I, 15 years ago or so, I briefly explored a run for Congress. I ultimately didn't run, withdrew from the whole thing, but a couple of organizations, the Democratic Party of Florida, AIPAC, who always tries to look at candidates to find out who's good for Israel or not. They were looking at a congressional race here in the area. E. Clay Shaw. Does anybody remember him? He served for 26 years. He was a Republican congressman from the area. Shaw was vulnerable, could have easily been beat. And I didn't ask for it. Unbeknownst to me, the party and AIPAC and other groups ran polling, and they put a lot of local Democrats' names in, and they threw my name in. Not that I ever ran for office, but because I blah, blah, blah all the time. And I was doing a weekly TV show, 2 weekly radio shows, and a bunch of other things. So going to Valencia Falls. And I was beating everybody in the polls. So I thought, oh, maybe I should run. And I knew Shaw could be beaten. He represented our area, yet he wasn't good on Israel and didn't go to Israel. How the hell do you get reelected? Number two, he wasn't good on the Everglades or beach restoration and those issues. 3, he wanted to privatize Social Security. So how do you get elected in our area with those issues? It's because the Democrats put the worst candidates up, the most anemic candidates against him, 13 elections in a row, and he won. So I figured, hey, I could win this thing. So I briefly explored a run, and I realized how many people didn't like me. I got calls from reporters from the Sun Sentinel and Palm Beach Post who said, hey, we're getting unsolicited phone calls from people saying, hey, we want to tell you something about Watson. Do you know that he uses cocaine? Do you know that he sleeps with his students? Do you know that he, all sorts of things, which of course, all of it's completely a lie. I didn't ask them who called because they wouldn't have told me and I would have looked like I was amateur. But what I did say is, of course, all this is baloney, but you don't have to take my word for it. All I'm asking the newspapers and radio stations and TV in the area, before you run any of this stuff about me, follow me around for a day. Talk to anyone that knows me and you'll realize that this is complete bunk. Hell, I'm a vegetarian. I play with my kids and write books. That's all I do. I just work. In fact, I remember joking with friends of mine saying, I'm so boring that I should let these scandalous rumors get out there. It'll help me appear to be a little cooler than I am. But they ultimately found out that it was just people that were, some of professors at the university that were angry and jealous and were making all this stuff up. Point being, I was not concerned about the negativity. My wife was very concerned about it. I told her, listen, nobody that knows this is going to believe any of this. And the people that do believe it, they're not worth knowing in anyway. But her view is, hey, we have kids. We have to live in this town. People are going to believe anything. She was probably right. So I didn't care. She was freaked out about it. This is the kind of thing we see between men and women. Okay. So let me move on. So I'm not sure if it's ambition, but what we find is women have a lot more qualms about things than men, and that's limiting women. So let me show you, here's some women that ran for president in history. This attractive young woman, this is the first woman, and then we'll end this. This is the first woman that ever ran for president. The year was 1872. Her name was Victoria Woodhull. A big fan of hers. She was a self-taught lawyer. She published her own book. She was smart. She was opinionated. Victoria Woodhull. Now, neither party would have her. And when she tried to even register to vote, much less vote for herself, she was arrested back in 1872. So she ran on an equal rights platform. By the way, her vice presidential running mate, the great Frederick Douglass, who did it as a favor to his friend Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So what a ticket, Victoria Woodhull and Frederick Douglass. I remember when Hillary and Obama were running in 2008, I was writing a weekly column on Sundays for the Sun Sentinel newspaper. And I wrote my column saying, Hillary and Obama running. I said, Frederick Douglass and Victoria Woodhull are in heaven looking down saying, what the hell took you so long? So there's Victoria Woodhull. Here's the second woman that ever ran. Voila, that's Belva Lockwood. She ran twice in the 1880s. She wasn't really serious about running. She was just trying to scandalize and shock people. But nonetheless, she ran, an impressive woman. Then we wait all the way till 1964. You might recognize this person, Margaret Chase Smith, a Republican from Maine, who was elected to both the House and the Senate and ran a very impressive campaign, distinguished herself in debates and the way she conducted herself. Her big complaint was this: the media always referred to her opponents as Governor so-and-so, Senator so-and-so, but they always called her Mrs. Smith, even though she had been a representative and a senator. Then we break the color barrier in 1972. Shirley Chisholm, there you go, 1972. You remember her? From New York, right? She had a great campaign motto, unbought and unbossed. So Shirley Chisholm broke the color barrier. I had a chance to interview her. Because she's from New York, that means she moved to Florida in retirement. It's a state law. So she went to Palm City. And she said two things. One, she said the biggest regret she had, the biggest frustration, was Black men. She said, Black men refused to support me. They said the first African-American that runs must be a man, not a woman. She said the same men that she marched beside in the civil rights movement refused to support her. So she said she felt that her gender was a bigger obstacle than her race. She said a Black man will get elected before a white woman. And I thought, yeah, baloney. She was right. Then in 1984, we break another glass ceiling, and that's Geraldine Ferraro. Remember her? also from New York. She became the first female vice president on a major party ticket. That would be Walter Mondale's VP in 1984 against Reagan, and Bush won. Because she was from New York, she had to fulfill the state law, so she moved to Florida. And I had a chance to interview her twice. And she told me her big frustration was this. She said when she gave her first speech as the historic first female nominee on a major party ticket, she said, I didn't want to give it about a women's issue, healthcare, the environment, children. I wanted to give it about a man's issue, national security. So she said, I put together a 30-minute speech on national security, and the first question she received from the press, who's going to be dressing you? You're going to be wearing Calvin Klein, Ferragamo, or, I don't know my designers. Who's going to be, what kind of question is that? First question. So I said to her, what'd you say? She said, I couldn't answer it. She said, if I talked about fashion, I wouldn't look like a tough commander in chief that could head the military. If I told them to screw themselves for asking it, I'd be the word that rhymes with witch. Do you remember Barbara Bush said that Geraldine Ferraro is the word that rhymes with witch? So that was Ferraro's big frustration. Also, remember how they treated her husband, John Zuccaro? So when a woman runs, they really go after her husband. In 1988, Pat Schroeder, remember her? District 1 of Colorado. She ran. I had a chance to interview Schroeder several times and get to know her. She wrote the foreword for one of my books. So I asked her the same question. What was her big frustration? She said she went around organizing women's clubs all over Colorado. And when she first ran for office, she said she was debating her male opponent. And the moderator said, aren't you being irresponsible in neglecting your maternal responsibility by running for office? You have a daughter at home. So Schroeder said, I'm glad you asked that, because I wanted to ask my male opponent why he's being so irresponsible in neglecting his paternal responsibility, because he has multiple kids at home. She also said her frustration was this. Sometimes a woman's biggest critic is another woman. She said she got as much grief from other women. She said she had a petite older lady once came up to her and wrote a check after a speech and handed her the check. As Schroeder took the check, it was for 10, 15 bucks, a small amount. She said the woman wanted to say something to her, and Schroeder thought she was going to say, I'm sorry, it's only a couple of bucks. Here's what the woman said. Now do something with your hair. I have notoriously messy hair, but it didn't prevent me from, a career doing media or speaking or whatever. Trump has the weirdest hair known to carbon-based life forms, and it didn't prevent him from being president. But Schroeder got grief about her hair. She also told me that another time, a woman came up to her and handed her a check and said to her, do you know your shoes and your purse don't match? And when she told me that, I didn't get it. I needed it. And now I'm married, so I understand such things, but I didn't get it at the time. But a man would never be asked that. If a woman wore the same suit 2 or 3 times, it would be a scandal. If a man wore the same suit all the time, nobody cares. Nobody asked, men about what they wear, but women got grief for it. That was in 88. Next, first, in 2000, that's Liddy Dole, Elizabeth Dole, Bob Dole's wife. She ran as a Republican briefly in 99 and dropped out. I remember when she ran, I was listening to NPR, which is probably the least sexist media outlet. And they were covering, of course, New Hampshire, which is everybody has to go to New Hampshire first. They were interviewing Dole. And here's the question the reporter asked her in New Hampshire. How are you going to walk around in that snow and sludge in New Hampshire in your high heel pumps? And I remember talking to my radio. I was so angry that they asked her that. Same thing with her. How do you answer that question? If she says, screw you, she rhymes with witch. If she talks about my Jimmy Choos or Ferragamo, she doesn't look presidential. No one asked John Kerry how he's going to walk around in New Hampshire with his expensive Italian shoes. Nobody asked George W. how he's going to walk around in his ostrich skin or some endangered species cowboy boots. Nobody cares if a guy does it, but if a woman does it. 2004, Carol Mosley Braun, a Democrat from Illinois, never a fan of hers. She was ethically challenged at best, not a very sharp candidate. In 2008, Hillary ran, came this close to becoming the first female nominee on a major party ticket, lost to Obama. But then in 2016, she secured the Democratic nomination, another historic first. She actually won the popular vote by the largest margin in history, narrowly lost the Electoral College. In 2000, oops, how did that picture get in there? You know, my son must have been goofing with this. I apologize to my Republican friends out there. Sarah Palin, an eminently qualified vice presidential nominee, to John McCain. So women, the first female Republican vice presidential nominee. And of course, here you go, 6 women ran in 2016. So that's a record number. Let me just end by saying all around the world, we've elected women to head governments. Here's a list of some of the countries. Noticeably absent from the list, the US. Here's a map I put together. Here's all the women world leaders now. You can see 27 countries have women at the helm, not the United States. Here's all the countries who have one point or another elected a woman. Look, all over the world, Africa, Latin America, Asia, Europe, all over the world, but not in the United States. Why? 2 major theories. One, many women that have been heads of government have been prime ministers, not president. There's a difference between a parliamentary system and a presidential system. In a presidential system, you have to win a nationwide contest in a 2-year-long, multi-million-dollar campaign. That's harder for women who have trouble raising money. In a prime ministerial parliamentary system, you get a safe seat in parliament. Once you rise up to being a leader in your party, if your party wins a majority, not even a majority, if you win a plurality, like in Israel, with the multi-party system, and you can put a coalition together, you're the PM. If we had that system in the US, Pelosi would be the PM. So it's a lot easier for women in a parliamentary system. The second theory on why we've yet to elect a woman is a lot of women around the world who have headed their governments have had direct family ties to the office. Familial ties benefit folks. Their dad before them was prime minister, their husband before them, their brother before them. So these direct ties have benefited women. In the US, these direct family ties have always benefited men. Didn't they benefit John Quincy Adams when he became our 6th president after John Adams? Sure. They benefited Benjamin Harrison, who was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, old Tippecanoe. They benefited George W. Bush, who was the son of George H.W. Bush. If W wasn't H.W.'s son, he would have never been elected dog catcher. He didn't even have a job. The Senate, the United States Senate is sometimes called the Millionaires Club or the Harvard-Yale Alumni Association. I always call the Senate the Sons of Former Senators Club. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Pretty soon this is going to benefit women. It's starting. Murkowski in Alaska, the female senator, her father before her, Elizabeth Dole, had direct family ties to the office. Bob Dole was the Republican nominee in '96. Hillary had direct ties to the office. Bill was the 2-term president. So in closing, here's some states. You can see that right now we have 102 women in the House of Representatives. In this 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, we have a record number of women in the House. A quarter of the US Senate, that's also a record number. 9 governors are women. So women are making historic gains. It's not equal around the country. You can see at the bottom of my screen, states like Nevada and some of those rural Western states that were the first to support women, they're still the most progressive in electing women. Over 50% of the state legislature in Nevada, 52% are women. Also Northeast New England, whereas the South is trailing. You can see the numbers, only 13% of women in the state legislature in Mississippi, pathetic numbers in West Virginia, Tennessee, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana. So it's not if, it's when we elect a woman president, and we're knocking on the door. I think the big thing is this current generation will at some point vote for a woman. Think of it this way in closing. If I think of my dad or my grandpa, and I came from a family of largely uneducated steel mill workers in Steelton, Pennsylvania. You can't make that stuff up. So I knew I was getting out of Dodge and not working in a steel mill. They never had, if they went to college, they never had a female professor. They never had a female doctor, nor would they have. They would have died first. They never had a female dentist. They wouldn't even have a female veterinarian. They never had a female accountant, female lawyer. But if I think of my students on campus today or my own children, All of them have had a female professor, female boss, female doctor, female lawyer, female accountant, female vet. Women make up a majority of those in veterinary medicine schools. Women make up almost half now in doctoral programs and in law schools and medical schools. Women are shattering the glass ceiling all across the country, and it's only a matter of time. So thank you for your attention and for the opportunity to give this lecture. Hello, Susan. and Judy,
Hi,
and
well,
Jason.
Hi,
that was
that was great.
excellent
Thank
as usual.
Thank
Oh,
you.
super.